So hello, welcome again to our webinar today on Arctic architecture, design, landscape architecture, and thinking about the built environment in a rapidly changing Arctic. My name is Victoria Herman. I am the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute and one of the principal investigators of the Migration in Harmony Research Coordination Network, which is a network of scholars, traditional knowledge holders, practitioners, decision makers from across the world that are coming together over the next 3 years to talk, collaborate, and ultimately act on creating a more sustainable Arctic in motion. This is a free network funded by the National Science Foundation. And if you are not yet a member, I highly encourage you to sign up. We have some great webinars coming up, and eventually we will have in-person events in Anchorage, in Washington, DC, and in Stockholm, Sweden in the years to come. Today, we have our 11th webinar in our series, and I am so excited to have two fabulous presenters here who I have known for a few years now, who are going to present their current work and some big ideas for how we think about the built environment, how we think about architecture, planning, design in an Arctic that is on the move, that is rapidly changing and rapidly warming. As we are going through the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat. If you have questions for our two presenters, you can put them in the chat at any point during the presentation, and I will be collecting those throughout this Zoom. We will then open it up to a question and answer discussion after the presentation, where I can read your question if you are in a place that doesn't have great internet, or you can come on video or audio and ask the question yourself. We will be recording this webinar, and that recording will go online on Friday. So if you have to leave early, not to worry, you can still catch what is being presented here at a later point in time. I think that is all of the housekeeping from me. So without further ado, I am going to pass it over to our two incredible presenters, Leena and Matthew, to introduce themselves and get us started.
Thanks, Victoria, for that amazing introduction. I'm learning about how to do Zoom better, and that is, your introduction is really an amazing example of that. Super nice. I love also that people putting into chat where they're from. Fantastic. We're really excited to be here today, and thank you again for the invitation to join. Before we start, Leena and I are both based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we want to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that Leena and I are on today, and the Monacan Nation, and pay our respect to their elders past and present. First of all, we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll kind of get our talk going. So my name is Matthew Jull. I'm an associate professor of architecture at the University of Virginia. I'm also a co-founder and director of the Arctic Design Group. This is a research and design organization Leena and I started in 2013, and focusing specifically on the Arctic and its challenges in terms of design. I started actually as a scientist before going into architecture. I was a geophysicist working in Iceland and also previously in the Yukon. And then I decided to become an architect and went back to school. So here I am, and the Arctic is our what we believe is one of the most critical areas to focus on in our work. So that's who I am, and I'll pass it off to Leena.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Victoria, for the great introduction. My name is Leena Cho. I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture at UVA, University of Virginia School of Architecture, and also a co-founding director of the Arctic Design Group, together with Matthew. Similar to what Matthew has described, I also come from non-design background and then switched into landscape architecture. I used to work a lot on the political, first studying political science and then moving on to a lot of the NGO work before then switching my career to design landscape architecture. So I think, before getting into some of our most recent Arctic work, we bring a quite interesting kind of interdisciplinary approach, that's bridging between science and community-driven work, and how we can begin to now engage these issues through a design-specific lens, mainly through architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design. So with that, I can start with our presentation. So today's lecture or presentation is organized in three different ways. One, we want to introduce our kind of critical and main approaches to how we begin to research and engage with the community and design and also teach. And then we'll be also showing some examples from our own students' work, mainly through the studios that we've been coordinating and organizing and developing in the past several years. And then moving on to sharing 5 different projects that we believe touch upon some of the key areas, mostly in Alaska. And then leading the lecture with the introducing and sharing some of our most recent work that then bridges from our current past work into the next several years. So to start off, what you see on the screen are the text, for example, here. I think, I don't know if you can see my cursor. But these are some of the approaches that we bring that we think are important when we start to think about the built environment in the Arctic. So first one, our combined design practice, research and teaching really frame the Arctic as a prime testing ground for the built environment in the 21st century, and especially in relation to the changing environmental norms of the 21st century. And then we also highlight multifaceted spatial practices, environmental adaptations, and technological ingenuities that have shaped the Arctic and will continue to shape the region. And in particular, this is where we begin to learn from the really creative and important indigenous spatial practices and material practices, and how we can begin to elevate those as we start to think about the current and future design practices. And all of this work that we will share, some of them today, allows us to, and also our students, to question the conventions of design practices, to reevaluate the purposes and mechanisms of built structures, as well as our own conceptions of landscapes, and to innovate the really important cultural and material linkages at the intersections of various design disciplines, spanning architecture to landscape to urban design and planning. But also in the midst of this, we actively collaborate and reach out to Arctic residents and non-design colleagues, such as environmental sciences, engineering, social scientists, and artists, to seek meaningful forms of collaboration that can bring positive, action-oriented changes to local communities.
So the first, we're going to talk a bit about some of the earlier work we did when we formed the Arctic Design Group. And before I do that, I want to just acknowledge also some of the folks that are on the call. I see Jack Heber is there, and CCRHC, Cold Climate Housing Research Center, amazing. We've learned so much from you through the years. And as we talk about our work today, it's really a learning process for us as we understand what other ways as we can as architects, landscape architects, urban designers work meaningfully within the Arctic region. So we started with creating a series of installations, and we believe that one of the most important things about our work is to communicate to those who haven't been to the Arctic and to our students about the place, the culture, the environment, the conditions, and what is happening. And so this kind of installation you see in this image are things we built with our students and down here in Charlottesville. In the next slide, please. And then also collaborating with the Anchorage Museum, we produced a set of what we call the Arctic Portals, which were a set of just small exhibition pieces. And again, the focus of these was to create kind of environments, immersive environments that people who hadn't been to the Arctic could maybe understand certain aspects of it. either the idea of being in permafrost or the idea of what it's like to be in a whiteout condition or in very, very bright light. It's sort of very sort of primary kind of conditions. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then and we kind of gave people this experience. This was up at the Smithsonian Museum of American History in DC and also out in Anchorage. And this was a kind of opportunity to immerse into a space that we'd created in a way to kind of recalibrate and provide a way for people to understand, you know, what is the Arctic, and to start that conversation, to sort of catalyze that. If you can travel there directly. Next slide, please. And so through the past few years, the projects, exhibitions like the ones we just showed you, in communicating to those particularly down in the lower 48, you know, we've brought our work together and kind of synthesized it in a book that came out just recently, Mediating Environments, that really synthesizes, as Leena mentioned at the beginning, our studios, our practice, our teaching, and that really is going to form the core of a lot of what we talk about today, plus the new work that we've been developing. Next slide, please.
And again, in one of the key things that we try to express and emphasize, you know, in this book is the fact that, you know, there is, you know, we cannot ignore the relationship, the fundamental relationship between the biophysical and cultural linkages, right? How we from the lower 48 and elsewhere outside the Arctic, you know, how we understand the Arctic is mainly through the practices of science, international policy, filtered through popular media. And often we believe that, you know, and rightfully so, you know, the issues that these communities are going through related to the climate change, urbanization, and political economic transformations that are part of that change are emphasized. But then at the same time, you know, as designers, we also want to foreground the cultural aspects of everyday life, you know, that are part of these communities that really create the identities of not only the community, but also can create the kind of aspects of the built environment.
I think to add to that too, and one of the things that you read about in the media so often is how the Arctic is undergoing drastic changes in the environment, and which it is, and through climate change, and also economic transformation that's happening, and pressures that are happening on remote communities throughout Alaska and northern Canada and throughout the Trans-Arctic region. But I think the one thing too that we want to acknowledge is the fact that the Arctic is filled with so many resilient people that have had such a capacity to live under extreme conditions for millennia, and learning from indigenous communities throughout the Arctic is one of really an important step, I think, in as we approach the Arctic as designers. The thing that's interesting too to us is to also understand and acknowledge the way in which the Arctic is so vastly heterogeneous, and that's one of the really remarkable things about you know, in our work and kind of traveling out through and visiting cities and communities through Russia and in Northern Europe, Canada, and in Alaska. You can see in this image in the top left, that's an image of Barrow, or Uktiavik as it's now called, in the summertime, kind of a nice rectangular or kind of rectilinear grid of houses, almost like a suburban. And then in the image below that is a picture of Norilsk, and that's one of the big mono-industrial cities in northern Russia. That's what we talk about gulags, you know, people, what were people doing in gulags? They were building cities like this in the early 20th century. And they're in extreme conditions, very, very similar latitudes. So, you know, you see very, very different typologies of buildings and of cities that have emerged, and learning how people, you know, built those cities, particularly in Russia, how they built the housing in northern Canada and Alaska, and what are the ways that we can improve on that. You can see also in this graph in the center of the screen. I don't know, can I draw on this screen? I don't know, does that show up?
Yes.
Oh, it does. Okay, great. In this graph here, perfect. I'd love to be able to draw. Okay. So you can see here in North America, tiny cities, really, in Russia, massive cities up in the Arctic cities. And so, to understand what was going on with these massive cities, how they were built, what technologies they learned, how do we take this knowledge and bring it back and understand, how we may think about the built environment in Alaska and vice versa, what was happening in Alaska, bring it over. And I think also at the same time is understanding how did Indigenous communities live and develop and adapt over millennia. So this is part of the kind of currency of how we're thinking about design. Next slide, please. So you can see in this image, there's a beautiful photo here from Fairbanks. I forget the name of the street this is on, but it's an amazing, one of our colleagues in Fairbanks pointed it out. This house is slowly sinking into the permafrost. You can see this sort of amazing kind of arc as it sort of sinks and deforms. A kind of a really good example of a bad housing design that's been brought from the south and then plumped down into the Arctic on permafrost. And then it's really destroying and degrading the ground underneath. And this is a really good example of design and architecture that doesn't work. And you see examples throughout the Arctic like this. In the center image here, you see an image this is actually from Resolute Bay, and it's one of the Canadian research facilities. And it's an outpost for research. But what you see here as well is also a hermetically sealed environment, a place where the environment is totally negated. It's an extreme environment, of course. But at the same time, you understand that there is no synthesis between the buildings and their environment. It's a kind of off-world, moon-like kind of landscape. And as we look at conditions like this, different ways in which the built environment has adapted and evolved, and we're kind of bringing forward the idea, how does cultural and social value, how does that come into play here? And this is a really critical aspect of architecture that we really want to emphasize in landscape architecture and urban design, is that we are not, our goal is not to optimize for efficiency and economy only. It's to optimize for social and cultural value at the same time. How do we bring that into the conversation? And that is one of the kind of key elements of our work. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. One of the really interesting things in talking about materials, and throughout much of the Arctic, it's extremely remote, and so material scarcity is a fact of life. And barges shipping up materials or by plane, sometimes ice roads, but very much it's a question of logistical and material challenges. And one of the really interesting things that you find is that this gravel in the ground and the use of gravel is such a fundamental material in order to be able to build on permafrost. And these two images show just examples in Nuktiavik about how the harvesting of gravel plays such a crucial role in the community. Next slide, please. And there are other factors as well. And I know, Leena, I don't know if you wanted to add something more to that slide. I know you're so, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, one thing that I might add to this is that, it's such an everyday, ordinary material, right? Like when we think about the Arctic, gravel might be the last, or it doesn't come up in our mind first, right? But it's such a fundamental material that really, defines the construction as well as the stability, and then even the feasibility of the built structures.
So there's four, what we identified as four kind of key design challenges. This is from our Mediating Environments book, and one of the challenges is housing, homes, housing homes for people in throughout the Arctic. This is a photo on the left, someone from the town of Minto, and Hubert actually was his name, and he brought us into his house, and it had been handed down to him. And what was clear in Hubert showing us his house is how difficult some of the conditions are that people live throughout the Arctic, and what stresses are created in terms of health, and in terms of and mold, and it's you understand from visiting projects or visiting homes like this that we need to do better. CCRHC and Jack, who's on the right now, and also others that are from the organization, are working really hard on this and trying to understand how to build better homes, and that's a crucial factor. And we're trying to contribute to that conversation as well. And it's really a key element. And really the problem is that designs have been imported from other environments, other climates, and then they try to be adapted, but it's not very successful. So there needs to be an architecture of the Arctic that emerges. That's one of our key goals.
And another areas where we can focus is the ground itself, the permafrost ground, the thawing, frozen, constantly changing ground. And to us, the ground is really important infrastructure for Arctic communities. Not only because it is literally the thing that everything stands on, but also various aspects of the built environment, whether it's the foundation for the houses or buildings to utility door, to roads and whatnot, they all kind of intersect and touch the ground itself as well.
Another key element, or in terms of our approach, is to also think about public buildings and also schools. Schools have historically played a really difficult role throughout the Arctic, from residential schools that have caused tremendous amounts of pain through native Alaskan and Inuit and Inupiaq families and other tribes throughout the Arctic, just by creating a condition where their culture, traditional cultures, were negated through enforced curricula that have been introduced. And on top of that, and this is changing, it can go further, but it's changing. But the other part is that the buildings, the schools themselves are often also very institutional in how they're designed. And how can we actually bring more feedback from communities into the design of these schools that really support the values of the community itself, about thinking about the land and the environment, and how does that become because essentially where the children are learning and where forming a kind of central hub of a community, this needs to be an important building that or schools need to be important institutions that are really supporting the cultural and environmental needs of the people living there. So this is a really
Yeah, and just to add to that, schools often function as the community center, right? In many of the Arctic communities throughout Alaska, but also elsewhere, it's really where the kind of the private, personal, becomes the collective and communal. So in addition to what Matthew has just described, schools are, as much as the ground and the streets, are where we can begin to think about what might be the shared spaces might be like, whether that is indoors or outdoors or anywhere in between. What would this kind of shared spaces be like, where the communities can meet and gather, as well as from with other folks. And also to that end, the land itself, the relationship to the much broader and larger landscape, that really undergird the Inupiat kind of principles or worldview, and how we can bring to address these kind of smaller components of house or school or ground into then making a connection to its larger approaches to the landscape. Here in this particular slide, we actually quoted Jack's when he met with Matthew's students a couple of years ago, where he says, a house is not home, but a house is a place within home. The land is home, right? So we often kind of bridge and really cross between different forms of architectural or landscape architectural components, so that we're thinking about from the house, but then its relation to a larger surrounding landscape, as well as the kind of engineering systems and the biophysical elements that makes these structures possible, but also what they might mean in terms of ideas and the everyday cultural practices in relation to a larger surrounding land and landscape as well.
I think what's exciting about that quote too is that in some ways it's not just for the Arctic, it's for where we live anywhere. How we think about our relationship to the environment and to our environment, whether it's in the city and whether it's in the south, whether it's in the north. It's a different worldview, I think, in terms of what you value and what you take care of, and how you also live. I think that in some ways an aspiration, and it's a principle that I think is very powerful. So the next section we want to talk about is in our talk is about some of the work we've been doing with our students. And this is can you go to the next slide, please? So every year, UVA has been really a fantastic place for us to be to develop the Arctic Design Group, because we're given opportunities to teach studios focused on the north, and been incredibly supportive in that capacity. And so these are some images of and every year, every time we can, we bring students to the Arctic. I think now it's been 4 times, four times. And whenever we can raise enough money, we do it because we realize how important it is for our students. Some of them have never been to Canada, north of the Canadian border, let alone to the Arctic. So for them to kind of travel up and to actually not only just visit, and we really emphasize not to just, this isn't a holiday vacation, it's a research trip to understand and study and meet with and listen to people and residents, communities throughout the Arctic. Next slide, please. And so, do you want to talk about this one, Leena?
Yeah, so one of the initial ways in which we engage with our students when they begin to understand and study about the Arctic is the biophysical component of the Arctic, its environmental system, right? So what you see here is a series of sketches that are made by the students that are really examining and drawing and seeing the ground itself as a way to understand what's in there, and also what may be different from what they would normally think of about the Arctic ground. And then this kind of initial studies, that are paired with the site visits, it really begin to kind of create opportunities to think about the Arctic specific materials, right? The landscape and environmental materials as one of the drivers, as one of the biophysical drivers that can begin to kind of generate design ideas in the beginning. To visiting, for example, the existing infrastructure. This is a photo from Barentsburg, Svalbard, walking all the way to the kind of entrance of the mine that has been there since the Soviet time. And not only understanding how this looks like, but also how it functions as we get a tour of the mining facility and being able to talk to both the operators as well as the mine workers to understand kind of social and cultural aspects of the labor, right? And then how that then ties back into the kind of identity of the community as a whole. To something like this. This is a couple of years ago when one of our students, another kind of Reykjavik studio that Matthew led. And for those of students, that Matthew mentioned that have never been to the Arctic, understanding what it really feels like, and then how this wind, for example, and the snowdrift can begin to not only influence one's perceptual aspect of the environment, but also how it can begin to kind of bridge and transition into a design idea, right? So he's lying down here because, as you see, the snow is getting collected behind him. And there are many of different kinds of kind of in-person, in-situ tests as a way to understand and also begin to project what they could be able to do as part of the design system. And taking all these ideas, both kind of field work that they conduct, while they're visiting these communities, but also coming back to the school in our own kind of studio environments. Students are creating a series of instruments or a series of these physical models to communicate and further understand how these systems work and how they function and operate. But also what you see on the right side of the image or the slide is how we can begin to modify and introduce a variable into the environmental system so that we can begin to think about this as a design principles that could be facilitating a certain design ideas. And what you see here, for example, on the left side is the fog and the visibility of the fog, of the landscape, created by different types of fog, to how the air and aerodynamic systems might work as they were constructing through this kind of fabricated, through the model fabrication, and really examining, what, gets passed through when different perforations, different sizes of the holes to the walls or structures are introduced, and also what gets left and becomes a residual kind of material in material spaces on that system.
And so, as Leena is describing too, part of our, pedagogy as instructor, as with our students is to have our students learn by making, by experimenting, but really starting with fundamentals. I mean, understanding how does water behave? In this case, how does it melt? How does it freeze? What happens when it freezes? These are like just examples of experiments that they're sort of alchemy. Some of them are maybe really obvious. If you're a scientist listening to this, you're like, well, sure, of course, water expands when it freezes. But for students to actually develop these little like devices that are sort of looking at what to monitor and to calibrate and to understand what that expansion means physically. This is part of the language of design in some ways, is being able to go from the analytical to the creative, and how these two modes of thinking can somehow inform each other. Next slide, please. Coupled with the sort of fundamentals and looking at basics of physics, as Leena was describing earlier, the basics of light, the basic albedo, heat transfer. We also, bring in our work kind of deep dives into the history and cultures of the places where we teach and where our studios are focused. You can see, students, of course, looking at some traditional forms of housing. I mean, brilliant, ingenious in ways that, but most people don't really want to live in an igloo now. But still, the principles are incredible. And that's really a kind of fun foundation of understanding how simple but very powerful in terms of the outcome. But these images show a kind of survey of just some of the types of drawings that are produced in studies looking at by our students, looking at aspects of climate, aspects of, I think down here is relocation of Shishmaref, was one of our years where we're looking at how this town's going to be relocated, the cost of it, the different mechanisms by which it could move, how federal funding could be released to do something, and what that meant in terms of cultural sites within the town. There's so many complex kind of layers involved in what's happening, particularly when we talk about migration and harmony in the Arctic and how people are moving and having to readapt. There's so many interconnected layers of factors from the kind of government to the individual to the ancient kind of traditional knowledge, and how those change is really important to understand. Next slide, please. And a really fundamental part of our work with our students is to go to communities in the north and listen. This is with some of the elders in Minto, just north of Fairbanks. We actually had an amazing visit with the community with Jackie Schaefer, and she brought us to Minto, and it was so amazing to have her with us. She works with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and also with the CCRHC, and going and listening and understanding about how, as architects, as landscape architects, we can engage is fundamental to our approach. So next slide, please. And there are more images of this. Actually, more recently, I'm here meeting with North Slope Borough up in Utqiagvik. And this is Gordon Brower here, the Director of Planning. And then we also had incredible lectures down in Fairbanks with Tori Jorgensen on permafrost, understanding how permafrost works and how we can think about designing in relation to it. Meeting with the Barrow Utilities, BC, Utqiagvik Utilities. And this is, of course, here is a Cold Climate Housing Research Center. there's so many examples of and again of how welcoming people have been to us as we visited and shared their knowledge and patience with us too, as we're sort of beginning to understand better about how things work and how the built environment works. Next slide, please. So, we'll show a series of projects. Some of you may have seen some of these before. These are some of them in the book that came out, Mediating Environments. These are student projects, and they are the culmination of weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of research. Typically, a studio lasts about 3.5 months. This project was a really amazing an example of rethinking a house. And you can look at this section over here. Particularly interesting about this project was that it looked at thermal stratification through a house vertically, heat rises, how you enter and exit a building, a house, the type of spaces people would use. These students went and read through the recorded logs of community meetings in Shishmaref to understand what were the priorities of the communities, what did they want to have in their homes. And then documented them and made tables, wrote down everything that could possibly, and then started to think about designing the spaces in relation to those needs. And so, these are a set of studies, we won't unpack all these drawings right now, but essentially showing some examples of the kind of work, getting down to the detail of the wall section, and not only just the sort of conceptual idea. Next slide, please. And then, making physical models, that is a really part of the currency of our work as architects and landscape architects, is to convey ideas of scale and materiality. These are abstracted, of course, but they are part of our forms of communication. And this actually can work incredibly well. We would have loved to have taken the work and brought it to Shishmaref and talked to the community there. Unfortunately, we don't always have funding to do these things. So, but we keep trying, and that's what our goal is. Next slide, please. Here are some other examples of projects. This is a school in the center. You can see it's little, and these are small, and there's a lot to unpack in it. The school actually was a redesign of a school in Minto. And the idea was to think about, on the top image here, was to think about what happens during the course of a year in terms of the seasons, in terms of harvesting food, in terms of the environment. This is again through students talking, listening to. We went to the school itself, actually, the one that we're redesigning, and then also reading and sort of talking, and also visiting the archives in Anchorage and Anchorage Museum, and thinking about ways to integrate the school into the context, into the forest, and thinking about areas of thermal exchange that can happen. Ways that we can conserve materials, at the same time also connect the schools and the students as they're in the schools to the environment around them. So, and outdoor learning spaces as well as indoor learning spaces. These are all really preliminary kind of sketches, but there are in a way an effort towards starting that conversation about what future schools might look like, and starting. Yeah, that's really kind of essential to the work. Next slide, please.
And bringing us back to Reykjavik, the third project really gets to the idea of ground, and then especially at the intersection of a building and the ground. So what you see kind of with the orange pinkish circles in the middle of the slide is, how can we begin to think about this space underneath the building where it's, buildings have to be raised to minimize the permafrost degradation coming from the heat from the buildings. And so they're raised, but also oftentimes they are underutilized or unused spaces, right? And these have, several different implications, including, from the street and then just around the house perspective. How can we begin to create, much more integrated, much more grounded relationship to the ground at the city level? And how can these new relationships can begin to drive the forms of the architecture, especially at the bottom, and then also the massing of the architecture, such as buildings, but also, such as houses, but also larger buildings, and plugging this into thinking about various land uses that happen across the city, whether that is, a single kind of, detached houses to commercial zones, to somewhere closer to the ocean, and then even to the kind of industrial infrastructural spaces. And so this is another example where, we're beginning to think about, and, through our students' work, kind of renewed sense of the relationship that architecture and landscape architecture can bring, but also really kind of honing into the types of spaces that are residual and also the liminal, right? That are often kind of overlooked, and how can design begin to address those conditions, and also, kind of at a larger community level, how, as you can see on the left bottom image, can begin to create a new identity, between the buildings, in the semi-public public spaces in Reykjavik.
Can you go back to one? Can you go back to one slide? I wanted to make one other point here. As Leena was pointing out, no, the one after this, please. Yeah, this one. When you look at this column here of these sections, and you might be thinking to yourself, what are these sections? Why are they drawing them with like strange sloped floors? And and one of the things that just to emphasize, and in design, in architecture, landscape architecture, one of the things that is really important to do sometimes is to let go of preconceived notions of what is expected, and to just experiment. And so it's straddling constantly the realities of engineering, the realities of what is conventionally understood, and then experimenting and creatively kind of letting go sometimes, and just experimenting with things that may not, some of them may not make sense, but in the process of going through that experimentation, ideas may emerge that you didn't think of before. And that's what these drawings really mean. They're sort of like, as Leena is saying, this unused underbelly of buildings, which we have seen really incredible examples, particularly in Svalbard, of where the underside of buildings becomes a whole other space that is part of the building, beautiful space. And why could we not see more of that? So as a fertile area for experimentation and development, as a design area, that's one of the things. So that's, I won't go on further about that, but that's maybe how to read those drawings a little bit more clearly.
And then the example that Matt just mentioned in Svalbard. So, one example that we saw there in Longyearbyen was a kindergarten building. And then they were using this, underside of the building, the foundation space for semi-indoor outdoor play space for children. So what was really interesting about that moment was that we didn't know it was there. And then we are walking on the street, facing this kindergarten. And then we keep hearing these kids' voices and laughing and crying, from the ground. And that's what allowed us to then, kind of visit that kindergarten and then ask them if we can take a look what's going on. And that's, how the conversation really started. But then, going back to, this image as well, when we're talking about, what's the identity of that, semi-public public spaces in the Arctic, and how can we begin to, create and really kind of extend this liveliness that already exists in the communities into some of the space that are shared, right? In sometimes, very unexpected areas, but also as a way to think about, how we can begin to kind of foreground the well-being of the community through the imagination and speculations of the built structures themselves. And then coming back to Shishmaref, Matthew mentioned kind of the some aspects about this when he was talking about that regional, cultural and historical analysis, of Shishmaref is, this student work is really talking about, what's missing or what can be, better foregrounded in the current discourse of relocation, right? So, in here, the group of students were looking at this, in relation to the food security. So how can we begin to address, and use the discourse of the relocation as a way to then address food security, right? That's one aspect. And the second aspect is, in this particular project, They were working with two different sites. So one is Shishmaref, and the second one was the Weston Creek Hills, which is one of the locations that are identified as a potential kind of relocation site. But then what often we believe happens is that it's either or mentality, right? You have to either abandon where you really develop that personal and communal relationship to, and then move to somewhere else. But what if we can begin to, kind of think about the larger regional strategy where, and then which also goes back to, the Inupiat kind of understanding of the land as home, right? How can we begin to understand this larger region as home and understand these kind of cycles of the food, from, for example, hunting, and butchering to smoking, to drying, as well as growing vegetables. How can we introduce these more robust food systems and food practices as a way to think about this whole kind of efforts, right? So here in this project, they were thinking about this in three different aspects. One is, and I don't have a map here, but that larger scale, from Shishmaref to inland side, that kind of flows of movement based on the seasonal cycles that also follows the food, right? And the second one is, as you see in the kind of bottom half of this slide, is how can we begin to incorporate the food practices, the spatial dimensions of the food systems and practices as the foregrounding element of the urban design system, for thinking about the relocated site. And then the third component, as you see on the far right corner on top, is even at that kind of much smaller scale. So now we're zooming into the smaller structural scale. How can we begin to kind of arrange, combine, and locally kind of available materials to create microclimates to grow certain food? And in this case, they were looking at the cookbook. I don't know if you've heard of this, but there was a cookbook that was made, with students, at the Shishmaref Day School that already existed. So the students kind of, mine through that, cookbook, understand which ingredients, which vegetables, and which other, types of food that they use in the indigenous cooking, in Inupiat cooking. And then with those, how can we begin to create some of these smaller structures here to allow certain vegetables to grow much better than others. So from the urban scale to regional, as well as to a much smaller structural scale, and really kind of foregrounding, the interconnected aspect about the food system as the design drivers for Shishmaref. And these are, one image, that talks about, how, the everyday kind of like, stories that could emerge out of this. Sometimes, for example, mesh can collect water by trapping condensation from fog. Shade mesh insulates underground storage and maintains cold temperature. So, it's really bridging the microclimate, but then it's geared towards thinking about the food and really addressing what we believe is the fundamental kind of challenge, when we, discuss the kind of, the communities that are on the move, for example, and getting down into these very cultural specific issues as the kind of main driver for that design.
This is making me realize we should probably hurry. I think we're getting to the end of our hour here. This is us looking kind of chilly to have it last February. But let's go. We've got one more project to talk about, right? Is that, and then yeah.
So the most recent one. So we were very lucky to be able to travel to Piave just before all of that COVID lockdown happened in late February earlier this year. And then this particular studio was really focusing on the ground itself, right? The image on the left is the permafrost from the Permafrost Tunnel in Fairbanks. And, you can see the ice and then the tunnel that's currently being expanded, for example, by the CREL, the Army Corps of Engineers. And then here we also understand that, the permafrost ground is really a climate archive, right? You can see the plants and vegetations and bones from thousands and thousands of years. to what you see in the middle is the image from Utilidor in Reykjavik, which is an amazing kind of technology / infrastructure for the community. It's also so well maintained. It's almost like you're kind of stepping into someone's living room. What you see on the right is the ice cellar. Where, of course, as you all know, the substance, food is being stored and it's maintained and kept. So, like we're looking at the ground from multiple different lenses, from the engineering to communities, and then, from scientific practices. And what you see here is, the reinforcement of that idea, where ground brings, indigenous scientific, agricultural, and to engineering practices. It's really about that kind of socio-ecological understanding of the ground that we really wanted to test and point to. So what you see on the bottom four are, some of the kind of position drawings that our students produce. So for example, the left two are thinking about the ground specifically through the plants, right? Specifically through the tundra plants, that it's living, the ground is living, it's lively, it's resilient, as well as also it's, highly contaminated because of the legacy of military and scientific practices, dating back, several decades. To on the right, what you see on the bottom right, the two kind of square images, is that it's also, the ground remembers and it indexes. So, whether or not that is ephemeral, such as, the bird's footsteps to the wheels of a vehicle, to all the way to, kind of much longer kind of stratification, of the geology, as well as extractions, and then the ice cellars and such, right? So it's highly kind of hybrid, kind of material systems that we wanted to really emphasize. And within this area, how we can begin to kind of converge and hybridize these different ways of looking at and examining the ground, from science all the way to indigenous practices, as designers, as the kind of the baseline for them thinking about the design of the ground itself. And again, as I mentioned, and I'm going to go through this really quickly in the interest of time. But as I mentioned earlier, the idea of plants in the ground. It's not just about what grows and what's gathered, but it's also where other species, beyond the humans, right, can begin to interact. So it's really kind of that gluing element that we, some of our students were exploring. And then coming back to the particular site in Reykjavik, as you can see, for example, in that kind of center zone, in the upper images, looking at the Barrow Comprehensive Plan, which is the planning document that the city of Reykjavik produced recently in context of the larger North Slope Borough Vision Plan. We were able to find that this area has been extremely contaminated through some of those practices that you see on the bottom left. And then they had, noted some plans moving to the future. So for example, particularly, kind of new North Slope Borough building could, for example, can be positioned there, along with the expansion of the existing fire station, as well as the daycare. So we're always kind of, looking into the existing planning document, because that's the vision and that's the needs, the set of needs the communities themselves identified and also want to respond to, in addition to all the different ways in which we're engaging with the site in the Arctic through, from the kind of environmental studies to the spatial kind of mapping and such. And so here, going back to the plants, so it's that student group who, emphasized the role of plants, in Arctic. And of course, the plants can be used as phytoremediation technique, to create community shared gardens. It can also provide dust control mechanism, habitat mitigation, and coastal stabilization. And a lot of these are already happening through various engineering and scientific experiments. And so we wanted to tap into that and then think about, kind of expanded design strategies that again, tap into these cultural and socio-ecological elements. So here you see some images, going back to that same site. I think what was really interesting or kind of important about this particular project is that, this kind of remediation process, which will start out, for example, as part of thinking about and reorienting, the current conditions of the site. And then slowly and incrementally, building, and kind of, building those set of buildings as well as public spaces as part of this design investigation. And all of these were kind of driven by the community engagement because, and involving, the community members, to take part in and have a voice in, to create a sense of ownership from the very beginning of the design project, whether that is maintaining some of this to, linking to a kind of local, high school and middle school, kind of communities and students as part of the educational system, all the way to creating kind of, the public spaces that these building components are inserted and then part of, as a way to also address the larger issue in terms of the kind of reimagining, creating communal and public spaces.
So the last part of the talk, this is very short, is just to talk a little bit about some of the a couple of events and one kind of project that's just started recently. One is the Bridging Science Art Community in the New Arctic, which was an amazing moment here at Charlottesville. We welcome colleagues from across Alaska, and in particular, the Arctic Youth Ambassadors came down to join the meeting. It was amazing to hear from them from all across Alaska, to hear what their thoughts are about their communities and ways in which what were priorities. And we had designers and scientists meeting together, and we had a strange and beautiful music interludes that came together with a brilliant colleague, Matthew Bertner, and his colleagues. It was a really fantastic moment to sort of synthesize and kind of an alchemy of perspectives that were really exciting. And, because so much of what we believe about the Arctic is that, the future of the Arctic is really in the hands of the youth of the Arctic. And even from an architect's or landscape architect's perspective, also, what are the future architects that are from the communities that will help design their communities in the future? That's a crucial step, as opposed to outsiders coming in and saying, you should do this. That sounds like a kind of colonial model. So, we're really cognizant of that, and that's one of our things is how to engage youth across Alaska in terms of design, and from other countries for that matter. Next slide, please. So this was published out. We can probably skip the next slide. And just some of our colleagues, I know Howie was on the call, and Matthew Bertner, Claire, Arsalan, Adarian, Lewis, Philippe Rosetta Murillo, and Caitlin Wiley, our new colleagues here. We formed our Arctic Research Center here at UVA, and really excited by that. Next slide, please. Actually, before you go back, I want just to acknowledge too, just some of our partners, not only Cold Climate Housing Research Center, CCRC, but also CREL, the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, Tribin, Lars Nelson, one amazing colleague and friend from Javik, and as well as recently forming partnerships with the TNHA Housing Authority in Javik, North Slope Borough, and also UIC Corporation. Really amazing colleagues to work with going forwards. Next slide, please. This is our last thing we're going to talk about is just quickly about a recent NSF grant we were awarded. I'm really excited by this. It's the people, the organizations I just mentioned are colleagues with us, or partners. It's a 5-year NSF grant. Do you want to talk about this, Leena? Just to.
Yeah, and this project, which is a 5-year project, really brings a lot of the aspects that we shared with you so far. Not only in terms of, the kind of multidisciplinary approach to understanding and studying and communicating the knowledge, but also, the co-production of knowledge, how we can begin to create these new forms of knowledge, through various disciplines, but also various members of Utqiagvik. So there are kind of three key research components, for this project. The first one is understanding how urban systems component, buildings and infrastructure, such as roads and pipes and so on, interact with the surrounding air, ground, and water conditions. And it's really about understanding the changing aspect of the natural and built system together. And then the second component is to generate environmental design analyses and design guidelines for planning for the city to address how current and future management of the city's built environment can be improved. And then the third component is to study how our own research team and Utqiagvik residents communicate with each other across disciplines and cultures to produce knowledge that is useful, actually useful for the city itself. So on that kind of third component, both Matthew and I, as well as our team members from UVA are, research subjects on this matter. As we kind of, develop various ways to not only deploy sensors, for example, but also how we communicate with each other and different members of the city.
Yeah. So the development of these design guidelines from Leena's and my perspective in this project is really crucial. And that's something we're working with our partners on. We'll be building on the work that we've showed you, but also work of our colleagues and future work. I'm thinking about housing, infrastructure, planning within the community in Utqiagvik. Just quickly, we're doing some quick kind of pilot studies here in Charlottesville because we can't travel right now. And obviously we're not going to be setting foot in Alaska until COVID is under control. We're not going to help with spreading COVID around, obviously. So we're here and we're not, these are just examples of some of the instrumentation we're setting up, looking at ground conditions and air and microenvironment conditions throughout the community here. This is out at Morven, actually one of the properties. And do you want to talk about this one, Leena, quickly?
Yeah, and then our kind of main contribution to this project, is really kind of on this slide, where using the collected sensor and survey data from the city, that kind of environmental parameters of understanding this changing natural built systems, and then merging that together with the kind of cultural components of the built environment through community workshops, collective design threads, and also referencing the existing planning documents, together. Then we'll be looking at the architecture and infrastructural, levels of the city and understand how different siting, form, orientation, et cetera, are currently interacting with these environmental and cultural conditions, but also as a way to translate this study into the design and planning guidelines. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, and really interesting part of that is not only deploying sensors, but how the sensors are deployed, the process. Talking also about data sovereignty and how the community in Utqiagvik has sovereignty over the data. And this is ethics of data. This is a really crucial aspect of the project. In addition to, and our colleague Caitlin Wiley talking, in her focus of research on the co-production of knowledge, which is going to be super excited by. Yeah, and then our last slide here is.
And reiterating what Matthew has just said, but then some of the examples that we are thinking about, or ways in which in terms of carrying out and kind of concretizing this project, is that we'll be co-determining the sensor locations, right, based on the community-specific challenges and needs. And also these sensors would be, really kind of high density, to the level of like details, right? That could, begin to inform the human scale built environment. And Matthew also just mentioned about the data stewardship and open access, the open access of data and translation and visualization of data so that people can understand, what the collected data mean. And also incorporating place and culture specific design criteria, when we do the analysis and guidelines, and then of course, together with the community members, especially with the Planning and Community Services Department of NSB. And then again, we want to make sure that this study is meaningful and applicable to the needs and desires of the community members. And then secondly, kind of sharing different kinds of expertise and experiences, not only merging, various disciplines that we mentioned before, but also engaging different perspectives from youth to local, early professional for STEM-related training, and then kind of co-managing and monitoring these not only sensors, but then the process of designing this project. And then, of course, through community workshops and then the design threads, among others. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leena and Matt, for an incredible presentation. I'm sure everyone will join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. We have about 15-20 minutes now for a question and answer. I saw that exciting round of applause from Michael. Thank you for that. We had a few questions come in as you were presenting. The first is from Denali, who I think we might have lost. Denali, if you are still on, please unmute yourself. But if you are not still on, I'm going to ask your question for you. Denali wanted to know how many of the students in your studio are from the Arctic. And I think maybe a broader question of beyond listening to Arctic youth and their expertise for a future vision, how do you work with Arctic-based students who might be interested in architecture, design, landscape architecture?
Well, we have when we take our studios up, we try to take as many students as we can. And oftentimes that's probably about 14 students. So, in overall, we've not had as many students as we want to come with us. And we will, keep trying to increase those numbers. It all depends on funding. So that's about what happens when we bring our students in. It's also a little bit of safety too. We want to make sure that everyone, is really taken care of properly, and we have too many students that would overrun, particularly we're going up to Minto, it's around 200 people. We don't want to, cause a disruption. But in terms of the, opportunities for youth ambassadors or other students in Alaska and throughout the Arctic, we've actually, through our having the youth ambassadors come down here, it was one of our first opportunities to engage with them in a kind of with a larger group. We've met them on various members on occasion in the past, but we see, we're open in any way to help provide advice or guidance for any of the youth ambassadors or other students in Alaska. We know that right now there isn't a design school in Alaska, for example.
Right.
That's something that that we're very much aware of, and that needs to change. And I think that having a design school in Alaska would make a big difference and provide accessibility to design education for students. Leena, do you want to add to that at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Matthew just all said. I mean, to give specific numbers, in per studio, say per semester, the student number ranges between 12 to 15. And sometimes it's, one instructor, either myself or Matthew, and oftentimes we're lucky enough to co-teach some of these studios together. And then I would definitely have to second in terms of the the opportunities that we can begin to create and accessibility of some of these ideas and methods to really, empower students, for living in Alaska as a way to think about their own communities and own homes. In a way that's determined by their own will and their own knowledge. So yeah, any kind of connections or opportunities that we're open to your suggestions, and feel free to reach out to us about that.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a great entry point to getting more engaged in this Migration and Harmony network, because that's where those types of connections and further collaborations happen. We have another question from Leanne, who has a bit of a spotty internet problem, so I'm going to read it for her. She wants to know if you could discuss how you integrate biophilic and biomimicry processes directly into your practice and your teaching. And she's interested in how you bring multidisciplinary scholars and practitioners into your practice, which I know you do quite a lot of.
Yes, if I can, kind of answer, there are two parts to this. If I can answer the kind of second question. So a lot of these, our collaborators, right? They are not only based at UVA, but also other folks who are in Alaska. We try to maintain a kind of regular contact. And then of course, with this NNA project, we are doing that. So oftentimes, we engage them, in our studio settings, as they can begin to give lectures and presentations from their own expertise. For example, Claire, who is our postdoc at UVA, but also a specialist in aquatic ecology and in biogeochemistry in the Arctic. She has given our students, amazing lecture about the permafrost and hydrology dynamics. As well as, of course, Howie, who's given us, kind of several different lectures in terms of the terrestrial ecology and the permafrost, but also I think more recently in Matthew's kind of current seminar, working with sensors and such, right? So that's kind of one form. But the second form is we also want to, show the process, share the process of design and the design outcome, not as in like this is the final project, but this is what our students have done at the end of the semester, and share that with the community members. So at the end of the ground studio for the final review last semester, we invited, folks from NSB, landscape architect, from Alaska, as a way to really start the discussions and kind of conversations using some of these ideas that have been generated from our studios to then, engage in further discussions about the community. So there are different ways in which we engage, experts and members of communities in different ways. And I think those two are some of the things that we've done, more recently.
And just a short addition to that is that we look to any we look for all sorts of inspirations for design strategies and ideas. The question was about biomimicry and and I think it's something that looking at alternative materials. I've seen also he's looked at fungus as an insulating material, not mold but fungus as a kind of. But there's also other we're open to all ideas about that. And there's a long history in architecture about biomimicry in some ways, and it with varying degrees of success but there's nature is most powerful, provides the most powerful examples of how to design, essentially. And how do we translate that knowledge into our built environment? That's a really huge question we're working on. So thank you for the question.
And while nature provides an incredible inspiration and design, it can also present challenges, which brings us to our next question from Pierre, who wants to know if you could comment on the challenges of mold in design and the built environment in the Arctic.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one of the you can get kind of, I don't know, I mean, those of you who aren't architects or engineers, you can get really kind of geeky about understanding the physics of buildings and building envelopes. And it's a really great question you're asking. It's the core of really one of the big challenges for housing in the Arctic. What happens essentially is that it's all about vapor pressure and about temperature gradients between interior and exterior buildings. You have very dry conditions outside through the majority of the year, and you have very wet, moist, humid conditions inside. And what that does is it builds up very big vapor pressure gradients between inside and exterior, so that drives through the building envelope to the exterior. But what happens when it's cold, that freezes. So that vapor, that moist air freezes and condenses and freezes, and then forms an ice layer. Sometimes it never goes away, it doesn't actually thaw, right? But that constant wetting of the building envelope creates a really, and the warmth from continual warming and cooling creates a great opportunity for mold to grow. And we all know how bad mold is. You inhale it, And particularly when you get a sealed environment like you have through much of the Arctic, through really the sort of normal modes of construction, and you're breathing in really stale CO2 rich, and then also get mold in there. It's a health disaster. And I mean, I don't mean to, I can keep talking about what CCRC has been doing. They have all sorts of different models of breathable wall systems that are really brilliant, and they've been working on this for decades. So I would highly recommend you go to CCRHC's website to look at some of the brilliant Arctic wall sections they developed that allow that not to happen, for this condensation freezing not to happen. And it's a really it's a critical question though.
And we will link to that in our follow-up email because it is a great resource.
Yep.
I'm going to ask Michael if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question to Leena and Matthew.
Yes, thank you, Victoria, and thank you, professors. My question is if you could speak a bit more about architecture for extreme cold agriculture. There's some examples of it. Modern Farmer had an article that cited, half a dozen, but there doesn't seem to be that much. And if you browse grocery stores in the far north, as I have done, the prices are tremendously high and the variety low. And second part of that, sort of following on, is to say, if you were to work in that area, wouldn't you need sort of an agriculture partner? And have you had any correspondence with that sort of person? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Michael. That's a really great question. And with MITA, it's one area that we haven't actually delved deeper into yet. But I know, in relation to the food, right? And then creating a sense of community through food is one of the fundamental issues that many of the Arctic communities face. In terms of the communities that we have been working with, especially in Alaska, they tend to be whaling communities. So, on the one hand, there is an issue of, okay, whether or not, creating and designing and building a specific architecture or design for agriculture is feasible. That's the first issue. And second hand is there a desire to do that at the community level, right? And oftentimes, sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. And that's what our experience has been so far. However, when we visited Utqiagvik this past winter, we met with this young woman, who was really trying to organize at the community level to build greenhouses. Because of course there is a kind of argument to be made in terms of the types of food that we eat, kind of fresh vegetables and others that they can grow as a part of not only kind of increasing the resiliency of the food system, but also as a way to create this collective sense of a well-being, right? So there is a need for that, and then there is a desire for that. I think as a kind of designers, if we're to tap into this, it's again, through this engagement of the community, as well as the kind of feasibility and then the kind of design kind of innovations of the architecture that can provide not only, spaces where things can grow, but also again, as part of the public, communal space, and how these architectural systems can provide something more than just that one kind of main functionality, right? And some of our students, just one more thing is, we've been also looking at, various kind of agricultural experimentation stations across Alaska, where they kind of house different types of seeds, to how to create soil, for example, to engineering kind of techniques when they begin to use plants for different kind of mechanisms and to create different types of microclimates. So I think the opportunities are there. But then again, I think the fundamental question would be, how to utilize that, as a way to, create not just that kind of, engineering optimization, but also something that touches upon the cultural and then the socio-ecological element of the community.
Yeah, just a kind of quick addition to that. Agriculture obviously is challenged in really high latitudes, and there is research in Alaska about high latitude farming. But if you kind of push it further north, as Leena mentioned, greenhouses are kind of key thing. You'll see often in people's homes they'll have plants growing,
hydroponics, yeah,
hydroponics, things like that. And that's a really important thing. Because it's true, like food security is a really big factor throughout Alaska, and it's also the same through northern Canada, in particular. So being able to produce your own food and then is really important. And you see examples of that in Nunavut. In Canada, as examples of farms. I think it's hydroponics or greenhouse growing, and also in Iqaluit, people have started smaller gardens, but it's really difficult in the winter months when it's dark to actually keep things going, unless But it's a hugely important area of subject to focus on, and I think that there's a way of combining the production of food with community spaces, as Leena mentioned. I think I've heard this actually also from some of the folks up in Resolute Bay about even chickens, growing chickens indoors, and that might be a way to also reduce the cost of food, because most people live on subsistence hunting, not just whaling, but subsistence hunting is a way of life throughout the Arctic. Thanks for the question. It's great.
Yeah, and also just one more thing is north of Yakutsk in Russia, I know they're also growing watermelons. I don't know how they do it, but they're doing it.
Right. Yes, they are, aren't they? That was crazy to see.
Like big, like really big watermelons. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we will have to find the watermelon growers for our security webinar in early 2021. I'm curious for that story and approach. Maybe as a final question, as we are at about time now, to bring us beyond the Alaskan Arctic. So Steve would like to know if your studies have found whether traditional solutions have been applied in Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland that can perform better. So beyond the Alaskan Arctic, are there built environment examples and solutions from Iceland, Greenland, Scandinavia that you've seen and maybe researched?
Yeah, I that's a really great question. It's amazing the audience today is that you're really spot on. I actually think that one of the most important things to take away from traditional knowledge and approaches to living in the Arctic and that has been done, developed for millennia is how to live with the environment, to integrate with the environment, and to live not as within a sort of fixed envelope, to actually think about, and what I mean by this is that this idea of metaspaces, the idea of breathability, like a home, and we talked about going back at the beginning or middle of the talk about what is the definition of home. I think actually the reference that Leena mentioned, the school that we looked at in Longyearbyen was one example in particular of an intelligence of thinking about metaspaces, that the school wasn't necessarily defined by a hermetically sealed volume that was mechanical systems that drove the heating of and conditioning of the space, that it was about spaces where children would sleep on the outside and kind of like not indoors, not outdoors. And there were then outdoor spaces exposed, and then there were underneath spaces. And there are all sorts of like different ways in which people were, children were occupying the spaces around the school. And it was, created a really, I think, a healthy environment, an exciting environment. And I think it also, was really inventive. And I believe that thinking comes from a very traditional perspective on how we, think about the environment and how we define the edges of our what we call a place we live. Does it stop at the front door, or does it keep going? And how do we care for it? Those spaces. So I think that's really, for me, that's the one of the most inspiring aspects of, if we were to abstract a little bit about what we've been learning. But Leena, I may have other thoughts you want to add to that. It's a great question.
No, I totally second that. That we should share the example of the kindergarten that we're talking about, so they know, what types of spaces that we're actually referring to. But there is this kind of sense of porosity between inside and outside, right? It's not a binary model where you will be sealed and be comfortable inside the building, And then when they're out, it will be otherwise. So, and then that's been, kind of the fundamental to the understanding of the landscape in the larger environment, not only from the traditional perspectives, but also some of the work that are coming out in Alaska, such as HRC and other, kind of amazing design research organizations. And also, I think, another thing that I might add to this is that, and this is also something that we, emphasize, not only throughout our studios, but also design practice, and also most recently with the NNA project, is that, people have different worldviews about the land and the landscapes. And then that, I think, that differences, and the richness of the differences really become, highly articulated in an environment such as the Arctic, when the environment is a lot more extreme than other kind of lower 48, right? So how to kind of listen into and engage with these various kind of epistemological differences, about the landscape, I think that's, one important kind of lessons that we, take seriously, and then, we want to, communicate. And so it's kind of beyond the kind of, kind of technical side of things, but, the kind of larger ideas about the landscape and environment, and how those differences and richness can be incorporated into the designs of, the architecture to landscape architecture. But thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, and thank you for that great answer. And while I think we could continue to have a discussion all day, I am sure folks are getting ready to go to bed, for those of us who are further east or are just getting started with their day in Alaska and have other Zooms to go on. So I want to thank you so much, Leena and Matthew, for an incredible presentation and some really thought-provoking pathways that I think each of us will hopefully take from this webinar, do a bit of homework and research for ourselves, and come back and think about how we can collaborate through this network and through the Arctic Design Group. So thank you so, so much. For those of you who are on with us, thank you for spending your morning, afternoon, evening with us. As a reminder, we will have a recording of this that will go up a bit later this week, but this is not the last webinar of the Research Coordination Network. We have two wonderful webinars coming up in early December on Arctic borders and on public health and climate change in Alaska that I hope you will register for. And we also have an Arctic Winter College that we will be running for 10 weeks in early 2021 with a stellar group of about 25 presenters. And if you are an early career scholar, a student, a traditional knowledge holder, a practitioner, I highly encourage you to apply. That application is open until November 15th, but whether we see you there or at one of our other webinars, I hope to see you soon, and eventually to see you in person at our research coordination events. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday. Thank you, Leena and Matt.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.